when they told me this, I said, man, this is a Navy SEAL documentary. I said, I closed the door and I turned around and I said, I'm going to go do that. And legitimately, they all just turned around and just busted out laughing at me. And again, justifiable considering what they were watching versus who they knew, at the time. But I literally went that next week, signed up and started training and trained for a year in the delayed entry program and went in and did it. It was like it was more of an ego thing for me that I needed than anything.
Man, it's crazy. So, working with the Mighty Oaks Foundation, we work with, literally thousands of veterans, men and women who have served in the military, and so many in the special operations community. But there's kind of this idea, I think, in the general public that when we talk about trauma with people who have been in the military, it's because of what they saw in the military, what they experienced in the military, some situation, maybe a friend that they lost, something like that. That all plays into trauma later on in life. But it is, I think, I typically say it's 70% of people who come to our program. I don't know if that's true or not. It's very close.
I would venture even higher than that. I
that have experienced childhood trauma.
Yes.
And that childhood trauma is something that drives them into the military. And then it's kind of the thing that shapes their experience after that. So it's not the military trauma that, blows it up.
Yep.
But it starts in childhood.
Yeah. I think, you're absolutely right. I didn't realize most of my trauma came from childhood until I did that first session of psilocybin through the program. And when I did that, it really opened my eyes like, man, you've been messed up for a while. I was like, I don't ever remember being normal. Like the way I felt afterwards, there was just so much peace and clarity. It's like I've never felt that. And then I started digging into my past, and when all the issues started happening, I was like, man, this started developing at an early age. So yeah, the military was a small part of trauma. I really enjoyed what we did over there, right or wrong. I enjoyed it, just like most humans would. And it really opened my eyes to like, you're already screwed up. Like you're saying, it's probably higher.
Yeah.
And I think our biggest mistake in society is we're really adamant about supporting people who are alcoholics, who've been raped, who've been abused and molested, but we're also really missing the people who are just soft-hearted by creation and who've just been abused emotionally, verbally, and it's traumatized them and affected them in a major way. And when they tend to compare themselves to people who've been raped or abused, they don't want the help. Somebody else deserves that.
Yeah.
The reality is majority of the people have some type of trauma that they need to really dig into and get some help so they can grow and just get out of that box that they're in.
Yeah. I think the trauma too, to some extent, if you've lived through that as a child, equips you to be able to deal with the trauma of military service. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It did me. I didn't realize it. Like, I'm a pretty closed-off person. I've learned to open up throughout the years. Very antisocial. But it goes back through all the way to childhood. When the troubles started, that's when I started closing myself off at school. For whatever reason, that's why I started wearing black clothes. That's when I started letting my hair grow.
Yeah.
When I started hanging around the wrong people and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I want to take a tiny step back. Jeremy likes to say I'm slow, so I kind of takes me a little bit.
Sean's processing what we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yeah, a few minutes ago. I have to play it back in my brain. I've been punching the head a lot. But you mentioned earlier that like you felt like there was almost like an ego and pride that is what caused you to go, right? To actually go and join, enlist, and take that route as a Navy SEAL. And I just think it's interesting how sometimes something that could be seen as a negative, like, we're all sitting here, we're Christians, ego and pride is not what we should pursue.
Right.
But sometimes the Lord uses, a defect, a sin in our life to propel us into that next step. And so you go in, like, I'm going to do this, from a pride standpoint. But actually that's what was needed in order to get you to take this step to move forward and to propel you into this direction. I just think it's a interesting thing to note, as we talk about like the development of your character over time And, so a lot of people might be struggling with things that they've done in their past or wrestled with. Well, that's a part of their journey. It does not have to define their entire character as a whole.
Well, it's trusting God, right? It's trusting that God is sovereign. Like, God's bigger than my stupid decisions or immaturity or past or whatever. God can use me where I am.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good.
So
when did you become a Christian, or what does your faith journey look like?
As a kid, I remember 4 or 5 years old, sitting in the pews, climbing over the pews, and getting whipped. But there was never a true presence.
Sounds like a Baptist
God.
church.
Sounds like my church.
I don't ever recall my parents reading the Bible. Never recall praying. Couldn't tell you who Jesus was. Anything. Literally, we go to church across the street, the parking lot, come back, and they pop a beer.
Yeah,
it's like.
Yeah.
Legit, and just a very, very sinful life, like a lot of people do. They go to church and they go home and there's no change.
Yeah.
So oddly enough, for some reason, when I was about 13, I just started praying. I don't know why. I just knew there was a God. I didn't know nothing about the Bible, didn't know Jesus, didn't know who Jesus was. And I would pray up to like 2 hours a night. Sometimes I'd fall asleep, wake up, and continue the prayers. And
was there more significant trauma going on in this time that you recall, or
loneliness
just kind of
as a teenager?
Okay.
Is one of those things where I'm not a good-looking guy right now, but I was ugly kid. Especially if you think about it, when we're older, looks don't come into play as much. When you're younger, it's all about looks.
Yeah, sure.
And how popular you are. So I gotta admit, man, I didn't have a lot of luck with the girls when I was younger. So I'm pretty much recluse myself, and I would do things like draw and just stuff I like to do. So there were a lot of underlying issues there, insecurities that I had no idea was there.
And obviously, as you mentioned, some trauma at home as well, some hardship at home.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And like I say, if you don't start getting help with some type of PTSD or trauma within 72 hours, the chances of reversing it are slim to none. So it's important to get that help as soon as something happens. You don't even realize that you're traumatized. Like when I did the psilocybin 3 or 4 years ago, I was legitimately sitting there just staring at the river. And these things, this entity, it was legitimately a messenger of God just sitting there talking to me. And the things that he was explaining to me just tied so deeply into why I carry myself the way I do, the way I talk the way I do, the way I do certain things. Even to the point the way I became aggressive when I was younger. He tied it all back to one event, basically, and we talked about it. There was a time when I heard screaming in the middle of the night, and I got up, and my sister was in front of me, and I was here, and we were in a hallway, and at the end of the hallway was a living room and kitchen, and my mom's husband at the time was sitting on the couch, and I don't know what was going on. I couldn't recall what was being said. They were just fighting, and then he said something like physically aggressive to her, so I got in front of her and said, "Leave her alone." Well, then just so happens there was this 12-inch crescent wrench sitting on the table. So he grabs a crescent wrench and he takes off towards me, and I bitch out, pardon my French. I just start squealing and run behind my mom. And, you wouldn't think as a kid how wired we are to be a protector. And like I said, until I did that psilocybin, did it really show me like this was the moment. Like you've been traumatized through everything you've been through, and your brain has been wired to operate a certain way. He's like, but this is where it started right here. It was a divorce affected you. This is where your manhood was lost.
Right.
And, it was interesting. I didn't believe it, but the more I sat in it and thought about it, and it was real about how I'm affected emotionally, by things, did I really start understanding how true it really is.
Yeah.
It's deep.
We've had through our program, we have, say in our men's program, we have men who come to one of our locations, and it's a pretty isolated place, whether it's in California or Texas, here in Texas, Ohio, Virginia, the places that we bring people to are pretty isolated, and they're separated from their family. They're separated from all of these other influences and voices they have going on in their lives. And it's been fascinating to me over the years to talk to these men after 4 days, 5 days of being in that environment. And we're sharing truth with them through the Bible, and we're ministering to them. We're sharing testimonies and telling stories and getting them together with other people. And these realizations that they have of things they haven't thought about in 30 years. You talk about that event, but there is something to certainly the isolation from everything else that's going on in your life and a focus on, all right, let me understand what's causing me to think this way, what caused these patterns to develop in my life and in my mind and in my heart, and getting into a place where we can have those conversations and see that the number of men that have told me, I remember those things happening when I was a kid. I've just never thought about how they framed the rest of my life. Every relationship that I've had, the decisions that I've made, the directions that I've gone, I've never thought about it. Well, when you talk about, I'm created to be a protector, I tried to stand up and protect my mom, but when the pressure came, I backed out.
Yeah.
Well, then you say there's a pride and ego thing tied to me going into the SEAL teams and to do that. Well, yeah, there's a connection, but until you make that connection and realize what I was actually pursuing there was an understanding of masculinity and manhood and belonging and connection. And man, until you can come to ground on that, it's really hard to move forward.